So welcome everyone. Um, my name is Dr. Tyne Ori. So I'll be doing the presentation today. Ayana invited me to just come and speak about my research with you all. I think from a live that she's seen with myself and her sister, Dr. Mbili Shafe. And so it's entitled Beginnings of Teaching Our Children About Race and Culture. It's funny because this research will never not be relevant as long as we're living here. And so I didn't imagine that all this would be going on at this time as I was finishing my doctoral degree, which I just finished in May. So thank you. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Somebody got a question? Okay. So I want to see how I can also make sure I monitor the chat while I'm presenting. Let's see. Okay. So for the most part, you guys just see the presentation, right? You guys don't see all the other Zoom features on the screen?
Yep.
Okay, good. All right, so Dr. Tyne Ori, welcome to this webinar on teaching our children about race and culture. So I am a trained counseling psychologist, researcher, published author, and consultant. My work is dedicated to the upliftment of African people generally here throughout the diaspora. And I see our future success as being beholden to our knowledge of self, our acceptance of self, which will hopefully lead to a mutual process of all of us self-actualizing and then lead to the collective self-actualization. And I have a 9-year-old child, boy, who is of African-American descent from my side and Nigerian descent on his father's side. Ethnicity in my presentation, but I'm very open to talking about multi-ethnic families and some of the things that come up there as well. So this is my son. This is Nasir. So I guess it was divine that I was playing Nas. I didn't plan that, but yeah, this is Nasir. He was my inspiration for my dissertation research. And so I was in school for about 8 years, pretty much his whole life. He's 9 now. So I was in the program since he's like 1.5. And I found myself being so consumed with school and trying to finish and try to, throughout my whole 8 years, it felt like I was always trying to finish. And it brought on a lot of stress. A lot of my psychological energy was just focused there. And one day I look up, he's about 3 or 4 years old, and he has a lot of dissonance in terms of his racial self-image. And so we had a game called Chutes and Ladders that he plays. He always pick the white boy with the blonde hair. And I just noticed and monitored, and I didn't say anything because I had my own conflicts about bringing up race and, what that meant or what to talk about, what not to talk about. And then I also had some other instances where he had put a yellow towel on his head. He's like, look, mommy, I got yellow hair. And I'm like, okay, but I'm not trying to reject what he's saying, because sometimes when you reject, you don't want the child to internalize the feelings, or you don't want them to cling to that thing even more. And then another time he said he wanted pokey hair, which in his baby language was spikes, which you often see on European American children, but also like Asian characters on anime, they have spiky hair. And so those were the entrances for me of beginning to talk about race. So he brought it to me to where I was like, okay, now I have to figure out what I'm going to do with this. And at the time, in my head, I'm thinking his rearing is a lot different than mine. He's growing up on the East Coast. I was a double Howard grad. So I went for undergrad. I was there in grad school, and he was a preschool student at the early learning program there. And the population is predominantly Black. There was only one white family there at the school. So in my head, his rearing experience is a lot different. And what he was internalizing was totally different than what I expected. And so it so happened that the media that he was taking in was still inoculating him to this idea, which really is like a rite of passage for our children and for us, where we think that we are or we want to be white. And that's just kind of like one of the realities of, I guess, growing up in America. Somebody else said they've been through the towel on the head thing. Okay. So he's 9 years old. Yeah, he's 9 years old now. But I think he was around 4 or 5 at the time. Maybe 3, 4, or 5. But it went on for a number of years, and this is what led to my research. So the objectives of today are just to kind of go through and talk about the research that I've done, which is entitled Parenting, Race, and Mental Health, examining the relationships between race-related stress, racial identity attitudes, psychological distress, and cultural socialization practices within African American mothers of young children. And to engage mothers in reflective thinking and dialogue about the factors that contribute to discussing or not discussing race with our children. We'll also want to be of assistance to mothers in becoming more aware of age-appropriate subject matter and ways to facilitate learning with our child's development, where they're at a particular age. And then providing tools for families to engage in racial socialization practices. So I have a small list of books and media that I'm going to pass on and email out after the presentation. And it's not an exhaustive list, but it's just a start and some things that I've compiled thus far. Again, if any questions come up, just feel free to submit them in the chat. And so I have a meme here with a quote from Malcolm X says, "The mother is the first teacher of the child. The message she gives that child gives the world." And identity is one of the most important aspects of who we are and who we become. And it's the driving force of who we want to affect and how we want to change the world. And so I think it's so important that culture is a big part of what we talk about with our children, constantly engaging them in transmitting cultural knowledge and cultural heritage. At the age of 3 to 4 months, babies can perceive race. When I first read that was Dick Anzers and colleagues found that in 2010. That was really shocking because I think for Black parents, a lot of times we are in this ambivalent space about when to talk to our kids about race. Do they even know? Are they aware? And for me, I think something that was at the forefront was the innocence factor. My child's so innocent, and I don't want to introduce this thing that they're not already engaged in or thinking about, but they're constantly immersed in it. And basically, the studies that found at 3 to 4 months, as well as at 5 to 6 months, babies begin to perceive racial differences. They just had babies look at different pictures and different faces. And what they found is that babies would react to same race much more with a smile than they would to someone that was of a different race. So it just showed that there was some distinction, that the child was maybe trying to gauge familiarity between looks. And then around 5 years old, children begin to encode race into social interaction. I think this can also happen earlier. So something I think about with this particular one, it's like your child's telling you a story about, at school, I was playing with Susie. And then you're like, okay, who's Susie? And you're trying to get an idea, like, which child is Susie? And you're like, okay, a parent might say, what color is Susie? And they'd be like, she's peach. you know. And so this is the age where kids can actually begin to identify like people are different colors, and they see it literally as colors, which is adorable and innocent, you know. Around 7 to 10 years old, kids begin to understand that race doesn't change. It's a permanent characteristic, and that there are societal implications about race. So kids begin to understand more about racism, or maybe noticing that certain races of people do certain jobs. Just observing these different things in society, or comparing differences between themselves, their lives, and their friends' lives who are of other races.